Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the fifth part of GSA 200, Advanced Windows Environments. In this session, we'll learn how to search complex Windows environments. Previously, you've learned how to use the Active Directory Groups connector and the Sharepoint connector, which support a single Windows domain. But Windows environments might have multiple domains within a single forest, and users in one domain may access content within another domain through trust relationships. So we'll see how we can use multiple AD groups connectors, one for each domain. You may also need to set up multiple file system or SharePoint connectors to crawl content faster. Finally, we'll also discuss the use of multiple Saml bridges for NTLM security and the use of the Sharepoint Search web part for running GSA searches within SharePoint. As mentioned previously, the AD groups connector supports a single domain. If you have multiple domains, you will need one AD groups connector for each domain. Each AD groups connector will point to the domain controller for its respective domain. With version 3 of the AD groups connector, you will need all instances of the connector to share a single database, so that the GSA can query one instance at serve time to identify group membership across all domains. If you install multiple connector instances within the same connector manager, they will automatically share a single database. If connector instances are installed within different connector managers, for example for redundancy, each connector manager will need to be manually configured to point to a shared external database. With the new version 4 of the AD groups connector that is currently in beta, no shared database will be needed, as the connector will push group membership data to the GSA at crawl time. The file system connector feeds documents and ACLs to the GSA, and to use ACLs, group membership is needed. The AD groups connector can provide that. At serve time, the GSA will not need to use the file system connector for authentication or authorization. It will simply need to authenticate the user, then use the AD groups connector to identify the user's group membership within all of the domains. Again, as mentioned previously, all instances of the AD groups connector will need to share the same database so that cross-domain group membership can be identified. You may need to use the AD groups connector with the SharePoint connector. Previously, you learned that the SharePoint connector contains a single instance of the AD groups connector to identify AD groups and can also identify membership in native SharePoint groups. For additional domains, you will need additional instances of the AD groups connector. Again, all connector instances, both SharePoint and AD groups connectors, must share the same database. At serve time, the GSA will query one of the SharePoint connectors, which will be able to read all group membership from the shared database. With a single domain in SharePoint, you can use a single SharePoint connector, and it can identify domain group membership and native SharePoint group membership. But for redundancy, you might set up a single AD groups connector within a separate connector manager on a different machine and point both the SharePoint and AD groups connector managers to an external SQL Server database. Both connectors will use the same global namespace, which refers to the credential group to use. At serve time, the GSA would query the SharePoint connector, which would read all group membership from the external database. The GSA would be configured to use the SharePoint connector just for group lookup, assuming that you're using the connector to send ACLs to the GSA at crawl time, and will reference the same credential group used by the connector. Let's take a quick look at how you might use the SharePoint and Active Directory groups connectors together. On my GSA, I've already configured both connectors using an off-board connector manager, SharePoint connector, and Active Directory groups connector. Now in this particular case, I only have one domain, so I really could have gotten away with just one connector here. You'll notice in the SharePoint connector, my LDAP configuration settings are empty. And this part is basically what corresponds to the Active Directory groups connector. If I take a look at my Active Directory groups connector, I can see that it's pointing to LDAP for me. Now if I take a look at the remote machine where I have this configured, I have both of these running within the same connector manager. GSA connectors 1 is the directory on the remote machine. And inside there, I have my different connector types. And if I drill down, I can see I have AD1, my Active Directory Groups connector, and SP1 for SharePoint. So both of those have been installed. Now, when you use a single connector manager, by default, it will use the same database for everything, and that database is called H2. And I can see the files in here for my H2 database. This works as long as all of the connectors are within the same connector manager. But if I wanted to provide redundancy and have multiple AD groups connectors and or multiple SharePoint connectors, what I would need to do is point to an external database. So if I take a look at the file application context.properties, which is in my web-inf directory of the connector manager application, if I take a look at that file, at the very bottom of it, I have a section for JDBC data source information, and it's commented out right now. The connector manager supports SQL Server, Oracle, and MySQL. In a Microsoft environment using SharePoint, you're probably more likely to be using SQL Server than anything else. So basically what I would need to do is go to this file on both connector managers, and I would need to point this to the correct data source. This would allow all of the connectors to store information in the same place. On each GSA, under Search, Universal Login Auth Mechanisms, I would need to make sure that I had a connector set up. I would need to point to one of my SharePoint connectors in order to get both the SharePoint groups and AD groups. And I would need to instruct it to perform group lookup only. So if I had, for example, 2 SharePoint connectors and 2 AD groups connectors, assuming that I have 2 SharePoint environments and 2 domains, I would probably stand those up on 2 separate servers, and I would point my GSA to one of the SharePoint connectors. But again, all 4 of those connectors would need to write to the same database. Now back on my connector manager machine, if I'm running a single connector that's going to be talked to by multiple GSAs, I would need to edit a line in server.xml, and this is at the very bottom of server.xml. I can find server.xml in my Tomcat directory under conf, C-O-N-F. So server XML is there. At the very bottom of that file, there is a line that specifies remote ADDR valve, and it has a comma delimited list of escaped IP addresses. So right now it has 127.0.0.1, which is the connector manager machine itself, and it has my GSA. But if I wanted to set up 2 GSAs that could talk to the same connector, I would need to make sure that both of those are listed. The Saml Bridge can be used for authentication within AD environments that use NTLM or Kerberos. It's typically used within NTLM environments, but is an option if for some reason you cannot Kerberize your GSA. You do not need a separate Saml Bridge for each domain in a multi-domain environment, but you may want separate Saml Bridges to provide redundancy, or if you have multiple GSAs. If you have multiple Saml Bridges for redundancy, they can be placed behind a load balancer configured to use sticky sessions. With sticky sessions, the initial request made by a client is directed using the load balancer's algorithm to one server or another, but all subsequent requests from the same client will use the same server. All SAML servers can connect to a single domain controller, which will use information from other domains in a trust relationship. When using multiple domains, you may need to check ACLs to ensure that all groups are properly represented. If you're indexing SharePoint content, you may have groups from Active Directory and from SharePoint itself. You will also want to use all the other troubleshooting techniques discussed earlier, such as checking feed submission, viewing serving logs, and viewing security manager logs. The Sharepoint Search Box is a web part that's installed with the GSA Resource Kit. During the install, you can specify which sites will use it. It will replace the default search web part within the SharePoint templates in those sites. You can also specify whether results will be rendered using a local style sheet or by a GSA front end. If you choose to use a GSA front end, you will need to significantly customize its style sheet so that it works well within your SharePoint templates. Finally, you can specify the collection and front end to be used. At serve time, users can choose whether to search public and secure content or just public content. Users can also choose whether to search all GSA content or only SharePoint content. Users have already authenticated within SharePoint, and their credentials will be sent to the GSA when a search is run. If the domain uses Kerberos authentication, the GSA must either be Kerberized or must use the Saml Bridge. If the domain uses NTLM, the GSA will need the Saml Bridge since NTLM credentials cannot be delegated. Here's what happens when a user runs a search using the Sharepoint Search Box. The user enters their search query into a field named Small Search Input Box. This field, along with other form fields, is submitted to Searchbox Controller, which formats the query string and sends it to searchresults.aspx. Within this file, an HTTP GET request is constructed by Google Controller and sent to the GSA, along with the user's authentication token. The GSA authenticates the user, runs a search, and either returns formatted results or raw XML, depending on what you specified during the search box install. Finally, the results are displayed using searchresults.aspx. If the domain uses NTLM for authentication, the GSA will need to send the authentication token to the Saml Bridge to authenticate the user. This can work well with a single GSA and Saml Bridge, but becomes problematic if you want to provide redundancy. In a redundant environment, you might have multiple SharePoint servers and multiple GSAs behind load balancers. In this environment, we recommend that you use Kerberos instead if possible. The search box is configured during installation, as described earlier. It's installed on each SharePoint web front end using the GSA Resource Kit installer, which can also install the Saml Bridge and the web services needed by the GSA. It requires Windows Server 2003 or higher and Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007 or higher. The GSA will need to be Kerberized or configured to use the Saml Bridge for authentication. Users will need Internet Explorer 6 or higher, or Firefox 3.0.5 or higher. During installation, you'll specify which sites use the search box, the GSA URL, the collection and front end to use, and whether results should be formatted using a local style sheet or the XSLT of the front end on the GSA that you specified. To troubleshoot the search box, you can view its logs. These will be available from the console of the SharePoint web front end. The logs will contain information about authentication, such as whether NTLM or Kerberos is used, as well as additional information. Let's take a look at setting up the GSA Resource Kit and the Google Search Web part for SharePoint. There's a single installer for all three of these components. I'll go ahead and run the installer now. I'll choose custom just to see the three different components. So again, we have the Google search box, we have Google services for SharePoint, and we have the Saml Bridge. I'll choose to install the Saml Bridge even though I'm not going to use it now. And then I'll click on Next and click on Install. The first question it's going to ask me is for the IIS virtual server port number to use. This is going to create a new IIS virtual server. I'll go ahead and use 9090. I know that port's not being used. If you're not sure if a port is being used or not, remember you can use netstat with the A and N switches to find out what ports are currently in use. I'll click on OK. And this will take a minute. It's going to create an IIS virtual server, and then it's going to create virtual directories within that server. Now creating the Saml Bridge virtual directory. Now it's asking me about installing the Google search box for SharePoint. So it lists all of the sites, and right now basically just lets me continue. And then it asks me some general questions, where my GSA is, so I'll plug in my GSA. I can also plug in the collection that I want to search against, whether or not I want to use a local style sheet inside the search box component set, or do I want to use the GSA to serve with its XSLT. I can specify which front end to use. Of course, front ends control things like key matches as well as layout. I can choose public or public and secure. I can specify which of those is default. And I can choose to make the event log verbose, and I'll go ahead and check that for now. I will be able to change these settings after the install if I want. So I can click on Save. Now it's asking me a question that doesn't have to do with the search box, but it's for Google services for SharePoint, and my connector will need this. So I'll put in the local SharePoint website URL. And when I click on Verify, the services for SharePoint will make sure that they can talk to the API to get the right information. After verification succeeds, I can close this. And then the last question it's going to ask me is where my GSA is for the Saml Bridge. And again, do we want to enable debug logs? I'll go ahead and enable that option and click on Save. Once I click on Finish, the files have been written to my server. Now that the install is completed, if I go to my Start menu, All Programs, you'll notice I have an entry for GSA Resource Kit, which lists a whole bunch of items. I have the ability to view logs for the search box. I also have the ability to pull up the configuration wizard. If I pull up the configuration wizard, it lists all of the sites where it was initially installed, and I can choose any one of those, click on Edit to bring back this set of options again. Now at this point, I'm ready to go ahead and run a search and see what happens. So I'm going to go to another workstation. And on this other workstation, I have Internet Explorer configured to support Kerberos. So I'll go to the Shanghai site. And you'll notice that I have this Google Search web part. It says Google Search in the background, so that's an easy way to tell. And I'll search for content that I know has to be secure, content in SharePoint. So I'll use in URL :Shanghai. Run my search, and you'll notice it gives me the ability to specify all of my content or just my SharePoint content. It also gives me checkboxes for public versus public and secure. So all of this content is content that comes from Shanghai. Now, back on the GSA itself, I can take a look at the reports, and of course I still have serving logs enabled. So if I take a look at the last query I ran in URL Shanghai, I can see that information is coming from the web part. I can see my Kerberos credentials are passed along. My identity is validated. And then ultimately, in this particular case, I'm getting back my results. Now, if I came here and I didn't see any information, it might be useful for me to actually look at the log files on the web front end itself. So again, if I go back to Shanghai, go to my search box and choose View Logs, I get one log directory for everything basically. So I'll need to look at the name of the file. In this case, it has the SharePoint site name in it. So if I double click on that file, I'll make the text a little bigger. I can see that the search web part is being invoked. All of this information has to do with the search web part. It's sending my search request. I'm getting redirected. Again, the search web part's search results.aspx is getting redirected so that the SAML request can validate my Kerberos token and bring back my results. So I can refer to my log files to do debugging at different points in the chain. Because this is fairly complicated, I might need to debug before it gets to the GSA. I might need to debug once it gets to the GSA. To go back and review an important point to remember from this section, with advanced Windows configurations, you may need multiple AD groups connectors sharing a common external groups database. But with version 4 of the AD groups connector, the groups database is stored directly on the GSA, so this configuration will no longer be needed. This concludes our 5th presentation, Advanced Windows Environments. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 200 presentations.